She reached out her hand before he had a chance to offer his, and in that single, breathless moment, Elijah Shelby felt the entire architecture of his carefully constructed life begin to crack. It was the Autumn Cattle Fair of 1882, held in the sun-bleached town of Caldwell, Kansas, where the air smelled of livestock and wood smoke, and the particular kind of desperation that lived just beneath every transaction made on the frontier. Elijah had stood at the edge of the registration table with the quiet, impenetrable formality that had earned him his reputation across 3 counties. He wore a black frock coat despite the heat, a watch chain glinting at his vest, and he had never in his adult life extended familiarity to a stranger without first establishing the proper social order. He was the kind of man who removed his hat before speaking to a woman, who said ma'am, and meant it as both courtesy and boundary, who kept his handshake for men of business, and his nods for those he had not yet decided about. He had been about to do none of those things. He had been about to turn away from the registration line entirely, his transaction complete, his ledger tucked under his arm, when she had simply appeared at his left side. Appearing was the only word for it, because she had not announced herself, had made none of the customary female noise of approach, and she had thrust her hand directly into the air in front of him with the calm certainty of someone who had decided the outcome of this meeting before it had begun. "Ellen Fairchild," she said, "I believe you are the man who purchased the Hargrove parcel last spring." He had been so thoroughly startled that he took her hand before he even processed that he was doing it. Her grip was firm. Not the limp, gloved courtesy of a parlor woman, but a real grip, the grip of someone who had opened gates and carried water and worked the land with these same bare hands. Her fingers were warm and slightly calloused, and her eyes dark brown, direct, entirely unafraid of his stare held something that was almost amusement. In 34 years of life, Elijah Shelby had never been undone by a handshake. He was undone. His reply did not come immediately, which was a catastrophe in itself, because Elijah Shelby always had his reply immediately. He stood there holding her hand a beat too long, 2 beats, 3, and when he finally released it, he felt a disorienting absence, as if he had put something down that he had only just realized he'd been carrying for years. "I am," he said at last. "That parcel is part of the Shelby range now." The words came out more stiffly than he intended because he was using the stiffness as a wall, rebuilding as fast as she had knocked things over. "Then we are neighbors," Ellen said, and she did not say it with apology or anxiety or the performative sweetness that women were generally expected to deploy around men of Elijah's standing. She said it with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which she had extended her hand. "The Fairchild homestead is on the eastern boundary of what used to be Hargrove's land, which means your new cattle are grazing against my fence." He had not known that. He had purchased the Hargrove parcel through an agent in Wichita, had received the deed, had added it to his holdings without setting foot on the land itself yet, because this year's drive had taken every available hour from March onward. The revelation that there was a woman living on the boundary of that parcel, a woman who had just shaken his hand in front of God and the entirety of the Caldwell Cattle Fair, a woman who was now looking at him as though she expected him to have answers he did not yet possess, landed on Elijah Shelby's chest like a brand. "There is a fence dispute," he said, not a question. He had meant it to sound measured and businesslike. He thought it might have come out slightly strangled. "There is a fence dispute," Ellen confirmed pleasantly, "among other things." Those other things would take the better part of a year to fully unravel, and by the time they did, neither of them would be standing quite where they had stood before. But we are getting ahead of the story. Let us go back to before the handshake, to the morning of the cattle fair, so that you understand what each of them had been carrying into that moment. Elijah Shelby had woken that morning in the upstairs room of the Drovers Inn on Commerce Street, as he always did during the Caldwell Fair week, in the dark just before dawn. He had dressed by lamplight with the same systematic care he brought to everything: shirt pressed, boots blacked, frock coat brushed. His late wife Margaret had once teased him that he dressed as though each morning required its own formal occasion, and even now, 4 years after her death, he had not changed the habit. There was something in the ritual that steadied him. Margaret's death had been the great catastrophe of his adult life, the thing that had rearranged everything. Fever, the summer of 1878, swift and merciless and without warning. She had been 28 years old. They had been married 3 years. She had been 3 months along with what would have been their first child, and the fever had taken both of them. And Elijah had come out the other side of that grief as a man in a frock coat who made no unnecessary movements and offered no unnecessary words and bought land and ran cattle with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned the cost of caring too much. His foreman, a weathered Texan named Bart Coulter, occasionally noted that Elijah Shelby ran the finest operation in southern Kansas and the emptiest household, and Bart was the only man alive who could say such a thing without being dismissed on the spot. Elijah simply looked at him with those flat gray eyes and said that the household was none of Bart's concern, and Bart agreed that it wasn't, and they went back to work, and nothing changed. That was the man who had gone to the cattle fair on the morning of October the 3rd, 1882. Now here is what Ellen Fairchild had been carrying to that same morning. Ellen had been 27 years old, and she had been on the Fairchild homestead alone for 14 months. Her father, Robert Fairchild, had died of a stroke in the summer of 1881, leaving her the deed to 240 acres of rich Kansas grassland, a substantial debt to the Caldwell Savings and Trust, a small herd of mixed cattle, and approximately 4 neighbors who assumed she would sell within the season and return to wherever she had come from. Ellen had come from Ohio, originally, where she had grown up the eldest of 5 children in a farming family. She had come west with her father in 1877, when the promise of cheap land and open range had drawn Robert Fairchild out of the increasingly cramped Ohio soil. And she had stayed west because, by the time her father died, she had grown into the land in a way she could not fully explain to anyone who had not experienced it. She had learned to read weather and to read cattle and to negotiate with the feed suppliers in town, and she had walked every inch of those 240 acres until she knew them the way she knew her own breathing. She was also, as of this October morning, in serious and documented trouble. The debt to Caldwell Savings and Trust had been manageable under normal circumstances, but the summer of 1882 had brought a dry spell that had thinned her pasture and reduced her small herd's weight, and the bank's president, a smooth-faced man named Charles Aldrich, had sent her a letter in September informing her that her note would be called in full if she could not demonstrate sufficient collateral by the 1st of December. 2 months. The cattle fair was her best opportunity to sell enough stock to make a meaningful payment, but what she desperately needed was more than a payment. She needed a solution. The solution, she had realized 3 days before the fair, might be sleeping right next to her land. She had gone out to walk the eastern boundary of her property in the early morning light, something she did regularly to check the fencing, and she had found a portion of the old Hargrove boundary fence knocked flat, and Hargrove cattle which apparently were no longer Hargrove cattle, which apparently now belonged to someone named Shelby grazing on approximately 15 acres of her best grass. Not in a deliberate, malicious way, simply in the way that cattle moved through gaps when gaps presented themselves. But those 15 acres were 15 acres she could not afford to lose. And more than that, the situation had given her an idea. She had done her research. She was good at research, at asking quiet questions of the right people over time. She had learned over the course of those 3 days that Elijah Shelby was a man of absolute reputation for honorable dealing, that he paid his debts and expected the same of others, that he had land he was not yet fully using, that he was wealthy in the specific, consolidated way of a man who reinvested everything into more land and more cattle, that he attended the Caldwell Fair every year and registered his cattle on the first morning before 8 o'clock. So she had arrived at 7:45. She had not gone there with a scheme of seduction or manipulation. Ellen Fairchild was not that kind of woman, and she would have been insulted if someone had suggested it. What she had was a proposal, a legitimate business proposition, and she had gone to make it directly instead of writing letters that might be ignored or waiting for an introduction that might never come. She had gone to make it in the most direct way she knew, which was to extend her hand and introduce herself and establish at once that she was a person to be dealt with, not around. She had not anticipated what his face would do when she touched his hand. She had not anticipated the particular quality of his gray eyes when they finally settled on her face, the way they went very still, the way deep water went still, not frozen but concentrated. She had not anticipated the pause in a man who was very clearly not accustomed to pausing. She filed all of it away and let none of it show on her own face, because she was in a business conversation, and because she did not yet know what to do with information she had not gone looking for. Among other things, Elijah repeated slowly the phrase she had used as though he were testing it for weight. I would prefer to address those other things at a time when I have the relevant information in front of me. Would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow morning? I can come to the property. He was already reaching for his ledger to note it down. The formality had snapped back into place like a shutter in a wind. 8 o'clock, Ellen said. I'll have coffee ready. That is not necessary. I know it isn't, she said. I'll have it ready anyway. She walked away before he could say anything else, and Elijah stood there with his ledger in one hand and the ghost of a handshake in the other and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that the day had taken a shape he had not assigned to it. He did not care for that feeling. He also, and this was the troubling part, did not want it to stop. He spent the rest of that day doing what he always did at the fair, moving through the pens with Bart Coulter, assessing other men's stock, making purchases with precise economy, having conversations that were productive and mercifully brief. He registered 2 additional breeding bulls and arranged their transport. He had a dinner meeting with a feed supplier from Dodge City and negotiated a favorable winter contract. He was, by every external measure, exactly the same man he had been at 7 in the morning. Except that twice during the cattle assessment, when he caught a brief movement of a dark skirt at the edge of his vision, his attention split before he could stop it. And except that when Bart Coulter said, over whiskey in the drovers in that evening, here there's a woman still holding the old Fairchild place over on the eastern boundary of your new parcel. Elijah said yes, with a kind of careful steadiness that made Bart look at him sideways. She called on you? Bart asked. She introduced herself at the registration table this morning. Bart was quiet for a moment, which with Bart meant he was doing the polite version of asking a great many questions. She caused trouble. She has a fence dispute, Elijah said. I am meeting her tomorrow morning to assess the situation. He took a sip of his whiskey. She also mentioned there were other matters to discuss. What kind of other matters? I don't know yet, Elijah said. That is why there is a meeting. Bart nodded slowly. There was a pause, and then Bart said very casually, the way he said things he meant seriously, heard she's been running that place on her own since her father passed, 14 months. Elijah set down his whiskey. Is she managing it well? Heard she was, until this dry summer. Heard the bank might be making things difficult. Elijah said nothing for a moment. Then, 14 months. Yes, alone, as far as anyone knows. Elijah picked up his whiskey again. He said nothing further on the subject. But he lay awake in his inn-room a while longer than usual that night, looking at the ceiling, thinking about a woman who had shown up at a cattle fair and put out her hand before he'd had time to prepare for it. And he examined the feeling she had left in him with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to everything. And he did not like the conclusions his examination was drawing. He was up before dawn, as always. He dressed with his usual care. He was on the road east before 7, ahead of Bart, who had looked mildly surprised but asked no questions. The October morning was bright and cold. The sky, that particular clean Kansas blue that came before autumn, gave way entirely to winter. The grass along the road was brown at the tips and silver with frost. Elijah's horse, a dark bay gelding named Atlas, moved at an easy road walk, and Elijah let him, because he needed the extra time to compose himself. The Fairchild homestead came into view as he crested a low rise, and he stopped Atlas for a moment to look at it without being seen. It was smaller than his own operation, obviously. A frame house painted white, the paint weathered but not neglected, with a front porch that caught the morning sun. A solid barn, a water tank, a functional corral with good fencing, several outbuildings in reasonable repair. The pasture behind the house was thin from the summer drought, but the land had good bones, and his cattleman's eye recognized immediately that the soil here was rich, and the grass would recover strong with the fall rains. A kitchen garden ran along the south side of the house, past its summer peak but still bearing some late squash, the whole thing framed by a low picket fence. Someone had built this place with intention, and someone had maintained it with care. He rode down the rise and through the gate, and by the time he dismounted and hitched Atlas at the porch post, Ellen Fairchild had come out the front door with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed one to him before he could decide whether or not to accept it. He was, again, caught. He took the cup. It was hot and strong and very good. "Come around back," she said. "I want to show you the fence before we talk numbers." They walked the boundary together in the cold morning light, and Elijah said very little, because Ellen was doing most of the talking, and what she was saying was factual, documented, and precise. She knew exactly where the original Hargrove boundary line had been. She had the original survey documentation, which she produced from her coat pocket, folded neatly. She showed him where the fence had failed and where his cattle had been grazing, and she walked the perimeter of the affected 15 acres with steady, sure steps, and Elijah followed and looked and said, "I see," and "Yes." And when did this occur? At the appropriate intervals, and tried very hard not to notice the way the cold morning had put color into her face. "The damage to my pasture is real," she said finally, stopping at the far corner where the fence had been most thoroughly flattened. "I'd estimate the loss in grazing value at approximately $40. "I won't dispute that estimate," Elijah said. She turned to look at him. He had the impression she had expected an argument. "You won't. The fence failed on property I purchased. The responsibility for it transferred with the deed. I will pay for the fence repair and compensate you for the grazing loss." He looked out over the thin, frosty grass. "In addition to what we recover before winter, I can have a fence crew here within the week." Something shifted in her face. It was not sentimentality. It was something more complicated, more guarded, the expression of someone recalculating. "That is fair," she said quietly. "I make it a point to be fair," he said, and then felt immediately that this had sounded pompous, which was not what he had intended. She didn't seem to take it that way. She just nodded and said, "Then let's go inside and talk about the other matters." The other matters, as it turned out, were a business proposition of such clear-eyed audacity that Elijah had to work quite hard to keep his expression neutral. Ellen had done everything but arrive with a formal ledger, though she did pull a folded sheet of paper from her desk and spread it out between them across the kitchen table, which was clean and bare except for the coffee things. She had calculated the debt to Caldwell Savings and Trust down to the dollar. She had estimated the value of her land and livestock. She had assessed the growth potential of her operation against his, and arrived at a specific proposal: that Elijah lease her eastern pasture for his overflow, herd at a rate that would cover her bank payments over the next 18 months, with an option to purchase that parcel at assessed value if she chose to sell at the end of that term. It was a good deal. It was, in fact, a genuinely good deal for both of them. Her eastern pasture, with proper management, would carry additional cattle at a profit to both parties. The lease rate she was proposing was fair. The terms were reasonable. She was not asking for charity. She was asking for a business arrangement that happened to solve an immediate crisis, but that had genuine merit on its own. Elijah read through her figures twice. He did not rush this, because rushing the reading of figures was how mistakes entered. When he looked up, she was watching him with those dark, steady eyes, her coffee cup held in both hands, and she had the particular self-contained stillness of a person who has said everything they need to say and is now simply waiting for the world to respond. "You prepared this yourself," he said. "I did. This figure for land assessment, you had it formally surveyed. I had it appraised by Thurston and Mercer out of Wichita last spring. The documentation is in the file if you want to see it." He thought about it for a moment. "The lease term of 18 months would you extend to 24? A pause. Not of uncertainty, he realized, but of rapid internal calculation. At the same rate, adjusted by 3% annually for inflation. Another pause. "Yes," she said, 24 months at the adjusted rate." "Then I accept the proposal in principle," Elijah said. "I'll have my attorney in Caldwell draw up the formal agreement. Is Thursday acceptable for signing?" Ellen set down her coffee cup, and for just a moment before she reassembled her composure, something crossed her face that was raw and unguarded relief, real relief, the relief of someone who had been carrying a great weight for a very long time. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she was composed again and she said, "Thursday is fine." "Good." Elijah stood because there was nothing further to discuss, and this was the logical point at which the meeting ended. He picked up his hat. He looked at the figures on the table one more time, then at her. "Miss Fairchild, has the bank president been," he chose his word carefully, "appropriate in his dealings with you?" The shift in her face was subtle, but he caught it. "He has been professional," she said. "That is not what I asked." A pause. "He made certain comments in our last meeting," she said evenly, "regarding the impracticality of a woman managing this kind of property alone. He suggested that the most sensible solution might be to sell and return east. I told him I would find alternative arrangements. He did not believe me." Elijah held her gaze for a moment. "He will believe you now," he said. She looked at him, and this time she didn't reassemble quickly enough, and he saw the thing in her face that was more than relief, something warmer and more complicated, before she said, "Thank you, Mr. Shelby." "Elijah," he said before he had decided to. The briefest silence. Then she said, "Ellen," and it landed somewhere in his chest like a stone dropped into deep water, and he put on his hat and said good morning and walked out to Atlas with perfect steadiness. And only once he was mounted and moving back up the rise did he let himself feel it. The size of it, the strangeness of it, the fact that he had just said his name to a woman in the intimate way that men said their names to women they wanted to know better, and he had done it without meaning to. Which meant some part of him had meant it entirely. He rode back to Caldwell with the cold morning air in his face and thought about that for a long time. The lease agreement was signed on Thursday, as agreed. Elijah brought his attorney, a meticulous man named Warren Cates, and Ellen arrived at the Caldwell law office alone, in her good dress-up practical dark green wool and her Sunday boots, with her own copy of the documentation under her arm. She reviewed every line of the agreement before signing it, asked Warren Cates 2 pointed questions about the terms of the purchase option, and signed with a firm, clear hand. Elijah witnessed. Warren Cates witnessed. It was done. They walked out into the bright October street together, and there was a moment where the natural current of the situation might have carried them directly apart, each to their own business. Instead, they stood on the boardwalk with the dust of Commerce Street moving past them, and neither of them walked away. "Would you allow me to buy you dinner?" Elijah said, and this time he heard the formality in his own voice and understood it for what it was, a last resort. The formality was the wall. He had built it very carefully after Margaret died, and it had done its work, and now here was a woman who had simply walked around it. Ellen studied him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would." They had dinner at the Caldwell Hotel dining room, which was the finest establishment in town and the obvious choice for a man of Elijah's standing, and the food was good and the conversation was. This was the thing he had not predicted: easy. Not the strained, performed ease of social obligation, but the ease of two people who discovered, with some surprise, that their minds moved in compatible directions. She asked him about his operation. He told her, with more detail than he usually offered, about the expansion he'd undertaken over the past 3 years, the breeding program for his beef cattle, the particular challenges of the southern Kansas range in drought conditions. She listened with genuine attention and asked questions that showed she had understood. She talked about her own cattle management, the decisions she'd made after her father died, the mistakes she'd made and corrected. She was frank about the mistakes in a way that was neither self-deprecating nor defensive, just honest, and honesty in a person was something Elijah found. In that moment, he had been hungrier for than he had known. They talked about Ohio, where she'd grown up, and about Tennessee, where he'd been born, the eldest son of a farming family who'd moved to Kansas in 1870 when he was 22. They talked about the cattle trails and the railroad's effect on the market. They talked about books, which turned out to be a shared passion, and disagreed pleasantly about the relative merits of Mr. Twain versus Mr. Dickens. He did not talk about Margaret. She did not ask. But at one point, as they were finishing their coffee, she said very quietly, "Were you married before?" And it was the directness of it, the absence of social hedging, that made him answer directly in return. "Yes," he said. "She died in 1878, fever." He looked at his coffee cup. "We were married 3 years." "I'm sorry," Ellen said, just that. No performance of sympathy, no uncomfortable flourishes. Just the simple acknowledgement of it, and then she let it sit, and the sitting of it was oddly the most comforting thing anyone had done with that information since it had become his to carry. He looked up at her. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it the way she had meant it. They parted at the hotel steps, and he watched her walk up Commerce Street toward where she had hitched her horse, and he stood there in the lamplight for longer than was dignified before he walked back to the Drovers Inn. Bart Coulter was waiting in the lobby with a look of aggressive non-inquiry on his weathered face. "Business meeting," Elijah said. "At the hotel dining room," Bart said. "Yes, I imagine it was." "Good night, Bart." The winter came in over the course of the next weeks, and with it, a new rhythm. Elijah brought his overflow herd to the eastern pasture as agreed, which meant regular contact with the Fairchild property, which meant regular contact with Ellen. He made it his habit to check the boundary fence personally once a week, which was not strictly necessary given that he had a fence crew and a competent foreman. But he found reasons for the habit, and the reasons were honest enough. The fence crew was new to this boundary. The pasture management required coordination. There were drainage questions in the northeast corner. Ellen was always there when he arrived. Or rather, she was always on the property, which was a large property, and he didn't always see her immediately. But she always appeared within 20 minutes of his arrival, coming from the barn or the house or the back pasture, in her work coat and boots, her dark hair pinned up against the wind, with that particular walk of hers that covered ground without appearing to hurry. They fell into a habit of talking while they walked the fence line together, and the talking expanded gradually beyond the immediate business of cattle and pasture into the wider territory of their lives and thoughts and observations. He learned that she read broadly and remembered everything she read. He learned that she had a dry, spare humor that emerged in small, carefully placed observations, the kind of humor that required you to be paying close attention to catch. He learned that she had strong opinions about the handling of the territory's water rights, which was a political subject he had not expected her to have strong opinions about, and that her opinions were well-reasoned and correct. She learned things about him too, though he was less forthcoming. She was patient about it, in a way that unsettled him more than pressing would have. She asked him a question or made an observation, and then let him respond at whatever distance felt comfortable and did not push for more, and somehow this consistently resulted in him telling her more than he had intended. About the ranch, about Tennessee, about his theories of land management, his plans for the operation, his occasional doubts about those plans. He did not tell her about the worst of it, about the way the loneliness had settled into him after Margaret, the specific cold quality of it, about the dark months in the winter of 1878-79, when he had worked 16-hour days to fill the silence of the house. He didn't tell her how he had stopped attending church because the community of it, the proximity of other people living full lives, had been more painful than the isolation of the ranch. He didn't tell her that he had built his formality into a kind of armor, and had convinced himself so completely that the armor was who he was that he had forgotten the man inside it. He was beginning to remember, and it was terrifying. It was in November, 3 weeks after the fair, that the situation with the bank became urgent again, and it took a shape none of them had anticipated. Elijah had gone to Caldwell for a supply order and had been stopped in the street by Warren Cates, his attorney, who had a look on his face that Elijah associated with legal complications. "Charles Aldrich has been making inquiries," Warren said, keeping his voice low on the busy street. "He's been asking about the lease arrangement between you and the Fairchild woman. Specifically, he's been asking whether the terms of the note allow for a third-party payment arrangement to qualify as collateral." Elijah kept his face neutral. "And does it? The note is ambiguous. He could argue either way, but the more pressing issue is what Aldrich is suggesting as an alternative." Warren paused. "He's been telling people that the Fairchild land is likely to revert to the bank on default, and that he has a buyer interested in purchasing it quickly, a speculator out of Topeka." "She is not in default," Elijah said. "The lease payments begin this month. Aldrich is claiming that the dry summer's loss of livestock value constitutes a material default under a clause in the original note. It's a reach legally. But if he files on it before Miss Fairchild can respond, she would be forced into a legal defense that she may not have the resources to mount." Elijah was very still for a moment. The street noise continued around him, wagons, voices, the distant clang from the blacksmith's end. He was not listening to any of it. "What is Aldrich's interest in expediting this?" he asked. Warren looked uncomfortable. "There is some suggestion that the buyer in Topeka is a business associate of his." Elijah said nothing for a long moment. He thought about Ellen Fairchild walking the boundary fence in the frost with her survey documentation in her coat pocket. He thought about 14 months alone. He thought about a man in a bank office making comments about the impracticality of a woman alone and suggesting she return east. "I want you to review the note," he said, "today. I want a complete legal assessment of Aldrich's position and what would be required to counter it. Ellen Fairchild needs to know about this before Aldrich moves." "I can do that," Warren said. "There is one option that would make the entire question moot from a legal standpoint. If the note were paid in full, what is the outstanding amount?" Warren told him. Elijah looked at him steadily. "Draw up the paperwork. I'll cover the debt." Warren blinked. "Sir, the total is, I am aware of what it is. I want this resolved before Aldrich has the opportunity to file. If Miss Fairchild agrees to the terms, I want her note discharged by end of week." He picked up his supply list. "And Warren, call on Aldrich yourself, formally. Make sure he understands that any claim of default on the Fairchild note will be contested thoroughly and publicly. Make sure he understands who is contesting it." He went about his supply order with the same systematic calm. He was, outwardly, the most formal man in every establishment he entered that afternoon. But underneath the frock coat, underneath the watch chain and the ledger and the careful manners, something was running hot and clear and purposeful in a direction he had not assigned it. He drove out to the Fairchild homestead that same evening, arriving just before dark. Ellen met him at the door with the expression of a woman who could tell from a distance that something had shifted. He told her everything Warren had told him, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, watching her face as she processed it. She did not panic. She went pale for a moment, then color came back, then her jaw set in the particular way he had come to recognize as her resolve assembling itself. She asked two precise questions about the legal status of the material default claim, and his answers confirmed what Warren had already told him. "There is a solution," Elijah said. He laid out the proposal. He kept it formal because the formality was honest in this case. He was making a business offer, and he wanted her to be able to accept or refuse it without feeling that it was anything else. He would pay the outstanding note in full. She would be free of the bank. Her lease payments to him would remain as agreed, serving now to repay the debt to him rather than to the bank, at no interest, over the existing 24-month term. Ellen listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, working through the angles of it the way she always worked through things, honestly and carefully. "This is not the same arrangement," she said. "This puts me in debt to you personally. That changes the nature of the relationship." "It does," he agreed. "If that is unacceptable to you, I understand. Warren believes he can contest Aldrich's default claim on its merits, and I will support that contest fully at no cost to you. The lease arrangement stands regardless. I am offering the debt payment as an additional option, not a condition." She looked at him for a long moment, and he met her gaze steadily, and he made sure that nothing on his face said anything beyond what he had already said, because she needed to make this decision free of pressure. "Why?" she asked. He considered the honest answer. He had several to choose from, arranged in order of safety. He chose the one that was true without being the most dangerous truth, because Aldrich is operating in bad faith and I have the means to stop him from doing so, and because what you have built here is worth protecting. Something in her face softened fractionally. Then she said, "I'll take the debt payment option." "Good." He placed his hat back on his head. "I'll have Warren finalize the paperwork tomorrow." "Elijah," she said as he turned toward the door. He turned back. "Thank you," she said, and the way she said it this time was different from the formal "thank you" at the business meeting. It had weight to it. It had the weight of something real. "You're welcome," he said, and left before his face could say anything he hadn't decided to say yet. Charles Aldrich did not file. The news that Elijah Shelby had discharged the Fairchild note and had his attorney visiting the bank made the rounds of Caldwell within 48 hours, as news did in a small western town. Aldrich folded his default claim with the speed of a man who understood clearly that he had miscalculated, and the speculator from Topeka found no traction for his interest in the land. Ellen said nothing about it publicly. She paid her next month's installment to Elijah's account at the beginning of December with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. But when he came to check the fence the following week, she had baked him a pie, a dense, excellent apple pie, made from the late apples in her small orchard, and she handed it to him without ceremony as they were walking back from the fence line, as though it were a routine thing, and said, "It's apple. I hope that's acceptable." "It is," he managed, holding the pie with the slightly disoriented look of a man whose arms have been given something before his brain was consulted. She walked beside him without looking at him and said, "I've been thinking about the northeast drainage problem you mentioned. I believe I have a solution." And she launched into a methodical and entirely sensible explanation of a water diversion that would benefit both their operations. And Elijah listened and responded and argued one technical point and agreed on the others. And they talked about drainage while he stood on her porch holding a pie. And somehow this was the most natural thing in the world. He ate 2 slices of the pie alone in his kitchen that evening and thought about her. He thought about her a great deal, as December settled over southern Kansas and the first hard cold came down from the north. He thought about her when he woke before dawn, and when he checked his cattle in the evening, and when he sat at his desk in the evenings trying to read his books. The thinking had a quality he recognized, though it had been a very long time since he'd felt it, the quality of a person taking up residence in your mind without permission and entirely redecorating. The guilt came with it, as he had known it would. Not the sharp guilt of betrayal. He had never felt that Margaret would have begrudged him the possibility of caring for someone again. She had been too generous for that. but a softer, more complex ache. The guilt of moving away from a grief that had become, he realized, comfortable in its familiarity. The armor had been built for a purpose, and it had served that purpose well, and removing it felt like both relief and loss simultaneously. He went to church on the first Sunday of December for the first time in nearly 4 years. Ellen Fairchild was in the third pew from the front with a woman he later learned was her neighbor, Martha Breen. When he settled into a pew near the back, Ellen turned at some point during the preliminary hymn and saw him there, and she didn't wave or smile or acknowledge it in any of the ways that would have been socially correct. She just looked at him for a moment with those dark, calm eyes, and then turned back to the front, and somehow this was more acknowledging than anything else she could have done. He sat through the service with more attention than he had paid to a sermon in years. Afterward, on the steps, the social mingling that he had spent 4 years avoiding closed around him with the comfortable familiarity of an old coat, and he found himself talking with the minister, with the Breen family, and with Ellen, who stood beside him and introduced him to people she knew with the easy competence of a woman who had been knitting herself into the fabric of this community alone, while he had been maintaining his careful distance from it. "You know quite a number of people," he said to her at one point, the two of them momentarily clear of the crowd. "It's a small town," she said, "and I've needed help from time to time. People are generally willing to help if you're willing to be a person to them." He felt that land, the gentle precision of it. He said, "I have not been particularly willing." "No," she agreed without judgment, "but you are here now." He was there the following Sunday as well, and the one after that. It began, the way things began in small frontier towns, to be noticed and gently remarked upon by the community. The way that Elijah Shelby had taken to arriving at church at the same time as Ellen Fairchild and walking with her to the steps and leaving when she left. There was no scandal in it. They were both known quantities, both respectable, and their business arrangement was a matter of record. But there was the warm current of speculation that communities ran through the lives of their single members like a river through stone. Elijah ignored the speculation. Ellen appeared to ignore it with the serenity of someone who had decided that other people's commentary was not her concern. But on the Sunday 3 weeks before Christmas, as they were walking to their horses after the service, Ellen said, very quietly and without preamble, "There will be talk." "There is already talk," Elijah said. "Does it concern you?" He considered this honestly. "No," he said. "Does it concern you?" A pause. "No," another pause shorter. "Though I think it would be more honest to give it something to talk about." He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned to look at him, and there was no coyness in her expression, no performance, just the directness that was simply who she was, a woman who looked at things clearly and named them. "What would you suggest?" he asked, and his voice was very even. "I would suggest," she said, "that you stop finding business reasons to come to my property and come because you want to. And I would suggest that if you want to court me properly, you ask." The December air was very cold and very clear. Somewhere down the street, a wagon was moving. The last few churchgoers were dispersing with greetings and farewells. Elijah Shelby stood on the frozen dirt of a Caldwell street and felt the last of the armor do something it had never done before. He felt it choose to open. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said. "May I?" Ellen Fairchild looked at him for a long, still moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one, the contained pleasure of someone whose considerable patience has been rewarded. "Yes," she said, "you may." He called on her that Wednesday, the first call in the new, honest capacity, and he brought nothing except himself and his hat and the book of Tennyson he had been reading, because she had mentioned Tennyson in passing during one of their fence-line conversations, and he had remembered it, and he thought she would like to know he had remembered. She received the book with a look that was worth more than any formal expression of approval he had ever received in his adult life. They sat in her parlor by the fire with the winter darkness pressing against the windows, and they talked. Not about cattle or fences or drainage or legal documents. They talked about the things that lived beneath the business, about loneliness, about the particular loneliness of the frontier, about what it meant to love a place with the specific devotion that replaced all the easier, portable forms of attachment, about loss. She told him about her father, not the administrative facts of his death, but the texture of him, the loud, optimistic, occasionally impractical man who had bet everything on Kansas grass and turned out to be right. The grief in her when she talked about him was real and present, and she didn't smooth it over. And Elijah found he could receive it without flinching, because it was honest grief, grief he recognized from the inside. He told her about Margaret, not the administrative facts he had recited to her before, but more. The morning he had found her feverish, the 3 days of terrible hope, the silence of the house afterward that had never fully populated itself with sound again. He had not said most of this to anyone since Bart Coulter had sat with him the night of Margaret's burial, and even then Elijah had said very little. The words came now with the slightly effortful quality of something long unpracticed, and Ellen listened without interruption, and without the discomfort that grief usually inspired in other people. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like she was someone worth grieving this long." "Yes," he said simply, "she was." There was a comfortable silence, the fire settling, and then Ellen said, "I'm glad you are here." He looked at her in the firelight and felt something settle in him that had been restless for 4 years. "So am I," he said. Christmas came, the first one in years that Elijah did not spend in the specific efficient solitude he had constructed for the occasion. Ellen invited him to Christmas dinner, along with the Breen family and the minister and his wife, and Elijah arrived with a bottle of very good wine from the supply he kept for his rare moments of celebration, and found a table full of warmth and noise, and the particular comfortable disorder of people who liked each other. He had not realized how much he had missed the noise of people who liked each other. He sat beside Ellen at dinner, because Martha Breen arranged the seating with the cheerful transparency of a woman who saw no reason to be subtle about the direction things were moving, and Elijah found that sitting beside Ellen Fairchild at a crowded table was very different from sitting across from her at a business meeting. She was relaxed in a way he rarely saw, her laugh came easier, her humor was less contained. She argued warmly with the minister's wife about a novel. She helped clear the dishes without being asked and came back from the kitchen with a look of serene accomplishment that made him want very much to reach across and take her hand. He didn't. Not yet. But when they walked out to the porch together after dinner to look at the stars, the cold night enormous and full of light, he stood close enough that their arms were just barely touching, and neither of them moved away. "What do you want?" she asked the stars, not exactly asking him but not asking him, "for the next year, for yourself." He thought about it. "More than I did yesterday," he said. "I want more than I wanted yesterday." She turned her face toward him and the starlight made her expression very soft, and he had the sudden, profound awareness of her nearness and the weight of everything that had passed between them in these 2 months. All the conversations and the fence lines and the coffee and the pie and the church steps and the fire in her parlor and the great, careful distance they had been crossing together, one honest word at a time. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said, and the yes was too early and too complete for whatever he had been about to ask, and it made his heart turn over in a way he had not been prepared for, and he realized she had heard the real question underneath the one he hadn't asked yet. He reached out and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his and held on, and they stood in the cold starlight for a long time, and he thought about what it meant to be undone by a woman not diminished, not weakened, but opened, the way a house is opened when someone finally unlocks the windows and lets the air through. The new year came in with a January blizzard that kept the cattle close and the roads impassable for 4 days, and on the 5th day, when the sky cleared and the world was white and blue and unbearably beautiful, Elijah drove his sleigh to the Fairchild homestead and found Ellen already clearing the path to the barn, because she was always already doing the next necessary thing. And he picked up a second shovel from the barn, and they worked side by side without speaking for an hour, their breath steaming in the cold. When the path was clear, she put the kettle on and he sat at the kitchen table, and she stood at the stove and he looked at her back and said, "I want to ask you something." She turned around with the kettle still in her hand, and her expression said she already knew what he was going to ask and she was waiting for him to ask it properly. "I am not a simple man to be close to," he said. "I know that. I have habits of distance that I am still working against, and I have a history that I'm still learning to carry properly. I won't pretend to offer you something easy." "I haven't asked for something easy," she said. "No," he agreed. "You haven't. Which is one of the reasons I am asking you to marry me." She set the kettle on the stove and turned fully toward him, and her face had that particular quality again, the one he had first seen in October when the lease agreement had been signed, the one he had thought was relief but understood now was something more specific. It was the feeling of something long awaited arriving. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took both her hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was no performance of joy in it, just the deep, solid thing itself, the joy that had done enough work to earn its own quiet certainty. He kissed her for the first time there in her kitchen with the kettle beginning to steam on the stove, a careful, deliberate kiss, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back with the same clear intention she brought to everything she did, and it was not the frantic collision of 2 lonely people crashing together out of desperation. It was 2 people choosing each other with full knowledge of the cost and the weight of it, and it was the most real thing Elijah Shelby had done in 4 years. They were married in March of 1883, when the Kansas spring was just beginning to loosen the brown grass toward green. The ceremony was at the Caldwell church, small and warm, with Bart Coulter serving as Elijah's witness and Martha Breen serving as Ellen's. And the minister who had been watching this particular story unfold since December smiled through the entire service with the satisfied expression of a man who had never doubted the outcome. Ellen wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had made herself over the winter, and she walked up the aisle with the same steady, ground-covering walk that she had walked the fence line with in October, and Elijah stood at the front of the church and felt the last piece of the armor he had been wearing since 1878 simply fall away. He didn't need it anymore. He had found something better than armor. After the ceremony in the street outside the church, there was the noise and warmth of the community that had watched this develop, and Bart Coulter shook Elijah's hand with unusual firmness and said, very quietly, "She's good for you." And Elijah said, "I know," and for once didn't add anything formal after it. They spent the first weeks of their marriage settling into the combined reality of 2 lives that had been running on parallel tracks now joining. There were practical decisions to be made: how to manage both properties, where to make the primary household. Ellen had never suggested she would simply fold her operation into his, and Elijah had never assumed she would, and what they worked out was a genuine partnership. The Fairchild property became a second operating division of the expanded Shelby range, with Ellen continuing to manage it directly as she had always done, now with the resources of the larger operation behind her. What had been impossible alone became not only possible but promising, and by the first summer of their marriage, the eastern pasture that had been thin and drought-damaged was thick with new grass and carrying cattle at a weight that satisfied even Elijah's demanding eye. The drainage solution Ellen had proposed the previous winter, which he had agreed to on its technical merits, turned out to be better than either of them had separately imagined, and the northeast corner of the combined range became some of the most productive grazing land on the Shelby operation. They worked together with a compatibility that made Bart Coulter stop and look more than once, the kind of working compatibility that was rarer than the decorative kind of partnership and far more valuable. Ellen could read cattle the way Elijah read ledgers, with a fast, comprehensive eye that caught things others missed. He absorbed her observations and she absorbed his, and what they built together was better than what either had built alone. But it was not only the work. It was the evenings, when the work was done and the lamps were lit, and they sat together in what was now their shared parlor. They had moved into the larger Shelby ranch house, with Ellen bringing several pieces of her own furniture that she'd been unwilling to leave, including a rocking chair and a writing desk that now sat in the corner of the parlor, and made the room feel less like a formal chamber and more like a living place. And they read, or talked, or simply inhabited the same space in the particular easy quiet of two people who had no need to perform for each other. He was still formal in the world. He suspected he always would be. The frock coat and the watch chain and the careful manners were genuinely part of who he was, not affectation, but habit so deep it had become character. But Ellen never required him to be otherwise and never seemed to find it strange. And sometimes at the end of a day when she was sitting in her rocking chair with a book and he was at the desk with his ledger, she would look up and catch him watching her, and she would simply look back, steady and clear and entirely herself. And he would think about the cattle fair and the moment she had held out her hand and the exact way it had felt to be undone, and he would be grateful for it. In the summer of 1883, Charles Aldrich resigned from the Caldwell Savings and Trust under circumstances that were described in the Caldwell newspaper as a mutual agreement following an audit. The audit had not been initiated by Elijah, exactly, though certain queries he had made through Warren Cates in the spring may have directed attention towards certain irregularities in how the bank had been handling agricultural notes during the drought. The Topeka speculator never returned. The new bank president, a solid man named Harlan Webb, made a point of calling on the Shelby ranch in a friendly capacity that fall and pronouncing himself delighted to do business with the operation. Ellen heard this news with a satisfaction that she expressed as a single raised eyebrow, which Elijah had come to recognize as her highest register of approval. "You could say you're pleased," he suggested. "I am saying it," she replied, and went back to her book. He loved her more in moments like that than he had words for. The autumn of 1883 brought the second cattle fair, and Elijah went to Caldwell for it with Ellen beside him on the wagon seat, which was a development that generated considerable notice in the community and considerable satisfaction in everyone who had followed the story of how this particular marriage had come about. They walked the fair grounds together and assessed stock together, and there was a moment when they passed the registration table where Elijah had been standing a year earlier that they both looked at it at the same time, and a small, wordless communication passed between them, the shared acknowledgement of what had happened in this place, a year ago in the space of a handshake. "You were terrifying," he said. "I was determined," she said. "It amounts to the same thing." She smiled, and it was the full smile that she gave rarely, and that was worth, when it came, everything. The winter of 1883 was milder than the previous one, and by February Ellen knew she was pregnant. She told Elijah on a Tuesday evening after dinner, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, in the same direct way she had once told him they were neighbors and told him there was a fence dispute, and told him he could court her if he asked properly. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something important was happening, and he needed a moment to receive it fully. He thought about 1878, about the grief that had lived in him since that August, about the small life that had been lost before it had properly begun. He thought about sitting at a kitchen table 4 years later with a woman who had walked through his carefully constructed distance with her hand outstretched and her eyes direct and her patience inexhaustible. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she let him, and the kitchen was warm around them and the February wind moved past the windows, and he said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said quietly. "Everything seems as it should be." "Good," he said. "Good." He held her hand for a long moment and then looked up at her, and she was watching him with the expression that had the warmth in it, the one he had learned to read over the past year as the specific face she made when she was seeing something that mattered to her. "We will be all right," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We will." Their son was born in September of 1884, a healthy, loud-voiced boy whom they named Robert for Ellen's father, with the middle name James for Elijah's. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness of expression, which manifested in infancy as a serene refusal to do anything on anyone else's schedule, and which Elijah found, to his surprise, mostly charming. He was not a man who had expected to be naturally comfortable with infants, and he was not, precisely, naturally comfortable with Robert in the first weeks, approaching the baby with a careful, methodical attention that made Ellen bite her lip to conceal her amusement. But Robert, who seemed to have inherited a good portion of his mother's lack of patience for unnecessary formality, solved the discomfort by grabbing Elijah's finger on the fourth day with a grip that was entirely his mother's, and looking at Elijah with the gray eyes that were entirely his father's. And Elijah was undone for the second time in his life, and this time he made no effort at all to reassemble himself. He was a father. He sat in the rocking chair that had been Ellen's, the chair she had brought from her own house to his, and he held his son and felt the strangeness of the life he had not expected to have settling around him like a well-made coat. The operation continued to grow. The combined Shelby range expanded in 1885 when they purchased the Mercer parcel to the north, and by 1886 they were running one of the most profitable beef cattle operations in southern Kansas. Elijah's reputation for honorable dealing remained what it had always been, and Ellen's addition to the partnership had added a dimension that the community had come to recognize. The Shelby operation was fair to its workers, paid decent wages, and treated the small operators around them as neighbors rather than competition. This was not entirely altruism. Ellen had explained to him, with her characteristic clear logic, that an operation surrounded by stable, solvent neighbors was a more secure operation than one surrounded by desperate or resentful ones, and that the long-term cost of supporting the community's health was substantially lower than the long-term cost of tolerating its dysfunction. Elijah had agreed because the logic was sound, and also because the Ellen who had existed before he knew her had been a small operator in need of a fair neighbor, and he understood viscerally what the difference between fair and unfair treatment had meant. They had a second child in 1886, a daughter they named Margaret, a choice that Elijah made quietly and that Ellen received with the particular gravity she brought to things that required gravity. She did not ask him to explain it, and he did not, but she touched the name on the birth record with her fingertip when the document arrived from the county office, and she said, "It's a good name," and he said, "Yes," and it was. Margaret was, from the beginning, her father's daughter in temperament, watchful, precise, serious in a way that softened quickly when something delighted her. Robert was his mother's son, direct, decisive, inclined to take action before consulting an authority. Together they made a household that was, by the late 1880s, genuinely and simply full. Bart Coulter, who had watched all of this with the quiet devotion of a man who regarded the Shelby operation as the nearest thing he had to a family, remarked to Elijah once, around 1887, that the ranch house looked different than it had used to. "How so?" Elijah asked. "Like someone lives in it," Bart said. Elijah looked at the house from the outside with the foreman's eye that was also now a husband's eye and a father's eye. The porch had plants on it in the summer, Ellen's kitchen garden running alongside. Robert's wooden horse was abandoned at the porch steps in the way of small boys who had moved rapidly on to the next thing. The windows had curtains that Ellen had put up in the second month of their marriage, cheerful curtains that Elijah had mildly questioned the practicality of and that had turned out to improve the quality of the evenings immeasurably. A lamp burned in the parlor. "Yes," Elijah said, "it does." He went inside, and the noise of the household closed around him. Robert's voice from somewhere near the kitchen, Margaret's more particular small sounds from the parlor, and Ellen's voice answering Robert with the patient precision she brought to all of it. And Elijah Shelby hung his hat on the hook by the door and thought about the October morning of 1882 and the woman who had put her hand out before he was ready. He had been the most formal man at the cattle fair. He had maintained his careful manners and his deliberate distances and his armor of ceremony for 4 years of careful, solitary grieving. He had been entirely certain of who he was and where his edges were. And then a woman with dark eyes and a firm handshake and a clear voice had walked up to him before he had extended anything and simply reached across every border he had ever set. And the whole careful structure of his aloneness had come undone in the space of 3 warm seconds. He had not rebuilt it. He had not tried. That evening, after Robert and Margaret were in bed and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Elijah sat in his chair in the parlor with his book, and Ellen sat in her rocking chair with hers, and the lamp made its warm circle over both of them, and the October wind moved outside, and the fire was low and steady. Ellen looked up from her book and found him watching her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking about the cattle fair." She was quiet for a moment, the smallest smile at the corner of her mouth. "You recovered very quickly, you know, for a man who had just been undone. I had extensive practice at keeping my face composed." "You did," she agreed. "It took me 3 conversations to be certain." "Certain of what?" She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, the eyes that had been direct with him from the very first moment, from the moment before he had had time to prepare. "That you were worth the patience," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire settled. The wind moved. "Was I?" he asked. She set down her book and held out her hand across the space between their chairs, the way she had held it out across every space he had ever put between himself and the world. He reached out and took it. "Yes," she said, "you were worth every bit of it." He held her hand in the warm lamplight of their home, and outside the Kansas autumn moved through the grass that both of them had walked and learned and worked, the land that had brought them to the same boundary, and then opened, as land eventually always opened, into something neither of them had mapped in advance. He thought about the fence line they had walked in the October frost, the survey documentation and the lean years and the bad faith of small men, and the steady, undeflectable patience of a woman who had decided what she wanted and had simply, with the clarity of someone who did not have time for indirection, put out her hand. He had taken it. It had been the best thing he had ever done. Robert Shelby Fairchild, who was known to his parents as Robert and to his sister as something considerably less dignified, grew into a broad-shouldered boy who loved the cattle operation the way his mother loved it, with the whole physical body, not just the mind. He was riding competently at 7 and reading the pasture at 9, and by the time he was 11, he had opinions about the breeding program that Elijah took seriously because they were, often, correct. He had his mother's grip and his grandfather Robert's optimism and his father's gray eyes, and he was, in the full assessment of both his parents, exactly who he was supposed to be. Margaret grew into a girl who read everything she could find and asked questions that her father answered with the same methodical care he brought to all things, and her mother answered with a directness that did not condescend. She was going to be, both of them knew, someone who made her own way on her own terms, and neither of them found this surprising or concerning. It was simply who she was, and she had come by it honestly. The 1880s passed in the way of good decades, full of work and argument and weather and occasional difficulty, and the particular deep pleasure of a life that was genuinely being lived. There were bad years. A winter in 1886 that was devastating to cattle across the whole of southern Kansas, though the Shelby operation's careful preparation limited the losses. A summer of grasshoppers in 1888 that ate the kitchen garden completely, and sent Ellen into a 3-day state of focused agricultural fury before she replanted. There were legal questions about water rights and range access that required Elijah's careful attention. There were community decisions about roads and fences, and the railroad's expanding presence that they navigated together. But the center held. The center was a kitchen table and a parlor lamp, and two people who had met across a handshake and discovered in each other the thing that each had not known they had been looking for. Someone who saw them clearly and chose them anyway. By 1890, the Shelby Range was one of the largest and best-regarded operations in southern Kansas, and Elijah Shelby was still the most formally dressed man at any gathering he attended, and his wife still occasionally extended her hand a beat before he had finished deciding to offer his own, and he was still undone by it, every time, the way you could only be undone by something you had chosen to remain open to. He had told her once in one of those late evening conversations that covered the same ground in new ways each time, that the single most catastrophically disruptive thing that had ever happened to him was that handshake. More disruptive than the blizzard of '86, she asked with a small, controlled smile. Significantly, than the grasshoppers, by a considerable margin. She had tilted her head and considered this. "Good," she said. "Good," he repeated. "I wanted to be unforgettable," she said simply. "From the first moment. I wanted you to know from the first moment that I was not someone you could manage from a safe distance." He had looked at her for a long moment. "You succeeded," he said, "in both objectives." She laughed, a real laugh, the laugh that he hoarded because it came rarely and was worth the waiting for, and he thought about what it meant to love a woman like this. A woman who had shown up at the edge of your careful life with her hand out and her eyes clear and her patience absolute, and had simply waited for you to recognize what she already knew. He had recognized it. He was still recognizing it. He suspected he would be recognizing it every morning for the rest of his life when he woke before dawn and she was beside him, already more alert than he thought a person had any right to be before sunrise, her eyes opening to find him watching her with the same expression he'd been unable to conceal at the cattle fair, at the fence line, at the dinner table, at the church steps. "What?" she would ask. "Nothing," he would say, and she would know. She always knew. She had known from the very first moment, when she had reached across the distance he had built so carefully and taken his hand, and he had felt, in the span of 3 warm seconds, the whole careful world he had constructed begin to open. He had been undone. He remained undone. He would not have had it any other way. The Shelby Ranch prospered into the new decade, and the 240 acres that had once been the Fairchild homestead remained a separately proud piece of the operation, logged in the ledgers as Fairchild East by Ellen's request, and Elijah had agreed without argument because it was the right name for it, and because some things deserved to keep the names they had earned. The white house with the picket fence was maintained as a second working house for the season when the eastern pasture required constant management, and in the spring and fall, Ellen often spent her mornings there and her evenings at the ranch house, and Elijah sometimes rode over in the late afternoon to meet her there, and they would sit on the porch where he had stood with a pie in his hands and talk about the day, the cattle, the children, the thousand small and large things that made up the substance of their shared life. In September of 1891, their third child was born, another son whom they named James, a name that had been waiting since Robert arrived. James was quieter than Robert from the beginning, more observant, taking after neither parent specifically but drawing from some deeper pool, and he grew into the child who listened longest and remembered everything, and had opinions he revealed selectively and devastatingly at the right moment, which his father recognized as a trait with significant survival value in the world. 3 children, 240 acres plus the main range. One marriage that had begun as a boundary fence dispute and a firm handshake, and had grown, through cold mornings and legal troubles and 2 blizzards, and 1 grasshopper summer and 17 years of choosing each other, into the kind of deep, rooted, unperformative love that does not require an audience because it has become too essential for demonstration. Elijah still wore his frock coat to every occasion that warranted one. He still maintained his formal courtesy in business and his careful precision in all things. The watch chain still glinted at his vest. He was still, by common agreement, the most formally presented man in any room he entered. And Ellen Fairchild Shelby, his wife, still occasionally put her hand out a half-beat before he had completed the decision to offer his own, and still watched him with those dark, direct eyes that had known, from the very first moment in the October dust of the Caldwell cattle fair, exactly who he was underneath the armor, and exactly how worth the patience he would turn out to be. He had been undone in the space of a handshake. He had spent every day since being grateful for it. The last thing he thought about on the evening of their 9th wedding anniversary, sitting in their parlor with the lamp burning, and the 3 children variably asleep, or pretending to be, and Ellen's rocking chair moving in its slow, steady rhythm as she read, was not the cattle operation or the range or the winter contracts or the water rights or any of the 1,000 practical concerns that occupied the daylight hours of a man who ran a serious operation in southern Kansas. He thought about October. He thought about a registration table and the cold morning and the moment a woman had stepped into the space beside him without warning and simply put out her hand and said her name as though she had already decided how this ended. He thought she had. She had already decided. And he had taken her hand and been undone, and in being undone had found the thing that all the careful construction had been missing, the simple, solid, irreplaceable presence of another person who was entirely and honestly themselves, standing in your life with their hand out, asking nothing more complicated than that you meet them. He had met her. He was still meeting her. Every morning and every evening and every cold October day and every lamplit winter night, across the kitchen table and the parlor and the fence line and all the wide, grass-covered acres of the life they had built. He had been the most formal man at the cattle fair. She had shaken his hand before he extended it, and he had been and remained and would always be undone.